Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Danielle Allen, Director of the Edmund J. Saffer Center for Ethics at Harvard University. The Edmund J. Saffer Center is committed to advancing research and teaching on ethics in public life, ethics and public affairs. And it's always a great pleasure when we're able to bring our community together for a distinguished lecture. Tonight, we will have our inaugural Mala and Solomon Kamm Lecture in Ethics. Our lecturer is the distinguished Larry Temkin. He'll be speaking about being good in a world of need. But I'd like to start by saying something about the lecture itself, because this is a very special occasion for us. The lecture has been given to the center by our beloved Frances Kamm in honor of her parents. And the purpose of the lecture is that a leading philosopher give it on an annual basis to maintain the center's commitment to its disciplinary roots. As most of you know, if not all of you, I think perhaps all of you know, you should, if you don't, all know, that Frances Kamm is a leading moral philosopher whose work in bioethics has had an extraordinary impact on other philosophers and bioethicists. She's published widely on a huge range of issues in moral theory, such as whether and when to aggregate benefits across people and when the distinction between killing and letting die has moral significance. She's considered a wide range of practical issues illuminated by those theoretical discussions, such as assisted suicide, distribution of scarce resources, abortion, and genomics. Her work has also shown how consideration of the practical issues can enrich our understanding of the moral theory. The overall impact of her work has been to build a strong case for non-consequentialism and for a commitment to a case-based approach to moral decision-making based on principle. Frances spent 15 years at Harvard as the Lucius M. Littauer Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy at the Kennedy School, and she was a faculty committee member and senior scholar with us at the Edmund J. Saffer Center for Ethics. We're still mourning the fact that she is now at Rutgers as the Henry Rutgers Distinguished Professor of Philosophy in the philosophy department at that university. Frances has had a tremendous impact on students and those of us at the center. One of her aims as a professor has been to encourage PhD candidates in philosophy to investigate topics in bioethics in the belief that they're uniquely situated to advance bioethical understanding. In other words, philosophers have a special responsibility working across a variety of fields to sharpen and bring rigor and precision to our moral reasoning. Frances was also known always among us for her night owl habits. We could always be sure that Frances was working in hours and the rest of us were sleeping. And then Frances's other great virtue, in addition to ensuring that the work of philosophy never ended, there was always somebody doing philosophy at some hour of the day, thanks to Frances holding down the night shift. She also always has ensured that after our lectures, the first question is the best question. Frances inevitably raises her hand at the beginning. So this is the word of warning to you, Larry, but by now you surely know this, and brings the conversation to the heart of the matter right from the get-go. So there is no escaping the most significant, challenging philosophical questions, the dilemmas of moral reasoning. And we have all over years learned so much from Frances, and she has elevated our work routinely, consistently. We continue, as I said, to mourn her decision to transport herself to New Jersey. Nonetheless, we are honored, so honored that she has now offered us this lecture named after her parents, and are delighted that we'll be welcoming Larry Temkin in just a moment to give it. But first, I would like to invite Frances to say a word about those remarkable parents. Frances?
Well, Danielle, thank you very much. I'm surprised that I was spoken of at such length, but I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be remembered. So I want to thank everybody who's here for this lecture so much really for coming. And I want to thank Larry Temkin, especially for agreeing to speak. It's a great honor. My parents, Mala Schlissel and Solomon Kamm, were victimized by the Nazis in Poland's Tarnow ghetto, then in Plaszow work camp, which you saw described in the movie Schindler's List, then in Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and then on the death march from Poland to Germany. Their memories were always vivid of the trampling of rights, the cruelty, and the failure to aid those in need that they experienced and witnessed. Therefore, although they were not philosophers, but rather Mala was an artist and Solomon a designer, they had a deep concern with ethical issues, especially related to human rights. These lectures devoted to their memory are intended to promote philosophical inquiry into these issues that they cared about. Philosophy is a particular way of approaching ethical issues. It focuses on reasoning, logical argumentation, and critical thinking. It seeks truly normative conclusions, that is, conclusions about what should be done or not done and why, rather than empirical descriptions of people's beliefs about these matters. This philosophical approach is essential because we all need to make up our minds what to think about these important issues. Empirical surveys are not going to do that for you. The Mala and Solomon Kamm lectures are intended to provide the deeper understanding that we need in order to make up our mind about these important issues. The Edmund J. Safra Ethics Center at Harvard has supported the philosophical work of many faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates. I am one of those who has benefited from such support, greatly benefited. I now have another reason to be grateful to the center and to its current director, Danielle Allen, for agreeing to house this lecture series. Thank you very much.
It's such a pleasure, Frances, and such an honor to be able to celebrate the memory of your parents and the important lessons that their experience and life has for all of us. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the distinguished Professor Larry Temkin of the Philosophy Department at Rutgers University. And as I do, we will be transitioning to the lecture itself. And I just want people to be aware that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can use that throughout, but at the end of the lecture, I'll return to moderate a Q&A section. But you can feel free, even now, during my introduction, if you've got questions, feel free to use the Q&A function. So let me tell you a little bit about Professor Temkin. His contributions to political philosophy and value theory are too many to list. In a book titled Inequality, he taught us that our very concept of inequality is structurally complex. There are fundamentally different ways in which the distribution of a good can be unequal. For example, the dispersion can be greater, or the ratio of the welfare of the best off person to the average person or the least well-off person can vary, or relative disadvantage can be concentrated or gratuitous. Yet none of these ways in which one inequality can differ from another is reducible to a single sense of inequality. By tracing the distinct elements of this concept, Professor Temkin brought together technical work in economics and infused it with fundamentally philosophical questions concerning how we should think about the relative badness of structurally distinct forms of inequality. Professor Temkin has also fundamentally improved our understanding of the possible ways of valuing equality and inequality. For example, he introduced the idea that came to be known as prioritarianism, the idea that it's not inequality per se that's morally problematic, but rather that what is in itself bad is when some people are absolutely worse off than others, and therefore morality requires some form of priority for the worst off. In addition, Professor Temkin's work has helped to open up a whole field of study into comparative fairness and desert. He's made important contributions to the study of the formal normative properties of the good, such as transitivity, and he's written on practical reasoning, welfare, poverty, questions of population ethics. In short, he's made remarkable contributions to a remarkable number of important topics. And it's a real pleasure to have him with us this evening to present work that I think is part of a new book, if I understand correctly. Again, the title is Being Good in a World of Need. Professor Temkin.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for that generous introduction. You made me feel a little bit guilty today since I'm the person who worked hardest to bring Frances from Harvard to Rutgers, but I don't feel so bad about it. I've been trying to hire Francis most of my adult life. I want to thank you, Danielle, Emily Bromley, and everyone else who helped arrange today's event. I had the great pleasure of spending a year at the Program for Ethics in the Professions before it became the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. Speaking to you today brings back many fond memories of those I met that year, including Ted Aberg, Helen Hawkins, Jean McVeigh, Arthur Applebaum, who's in the audience today, Dan Wickler, and Dennis Thompson. It's an enormous honor for me to give the inaugural Mala and Solomon Kamm lecture in ethics, because I know how much Mala and Solomon Kamm mean to Francis, a philosopher and friend for whom I have the utmost admiration and affection. Francis, I shall try to do justice to your parents' memory, even as I know that my efforts must inevitably fall short. You should have all been given a handout. You won't really need it, but you might want to refer to it once or twice over the course of the lecture. Part 1, introduction. For most of my life, I've been deeply concerned about the needy. For many years, I've lectured and published on the topic, and along with Peter Singer and Jeffrey Sachs, I've helped launch a number of chapters of the Effective Altruist Organization, Giving What We Can. I've argued that those who are well off, including most of the developed world, are open to serious moral criticisms when they basically ignore, as most of us do, the plight of the world's needy. Nevertheless, philosophers are required to subject even their deepest commitments to critical scrutiny. And in this lecture, I raise some worries about the effects of aid efforts in the world's poorest countries. One particularly vexing issue concerns a possible conflict between what each of us individually ought to do for the needy and what we collectively ought to do. This lecture is more or less self-contained. However, due to time constraints, at some points, I simply present claims argued at length in my forthcoming book, Being Good in a World of Need. Part 2, Marketplace Distortions, the problem of internal brain and character drain. I start with a point familiar to global health experts, but largely overlooked in the aid literature. In fact, I've never seen it referred to in the aid literature. International aid groups promote many worthy projects, building schools, providing electricity or clean water, improving healthcare, and so on. Often they will need or want to hire local workers, managers, engineers, principals, teachers, doctors, nurses, administrative staff, drivers, road pavers, well diggers, and so on. Naturally, effective aid groups hire the best people they can for these positions. Ideally, dedicated, hardworking, reliable people with good leadership, managerial, and communication skills. To successfully attract such workers, aid groups typically offer higher pay and better working conditions than the local standard. This is possible because of the generosity of their Western donors. As described so far, this sounds like a win-win-win situation. Hiring such talented people will be great for the needy, the workers themselves, and the aid groups, enabling them to achieve their goals and attract more donations. Unfortunately, left out of this rosy account is what happens elsewhere as a result of this process. In particular, one needs to worry about the indirect effects of hiring talented people away from whatever jobs they might otherwise occupy. Governments in poor countries desperately need honest, reliable, and talented engineers, accountants, lawyers, teachers, doctors, nurses, managers, and civil servants working on behalf of the general public. Unfortunately, however, most poor governments cannot match the pay scale or working conditions that many aid groups offer. This may result in an internal brain and character drain away from government and public sector jobs, which may significantly undermine the efficiency of the government the economy, and public projects. Moreover, one might see highly trained professionals accept jobs for which they are overqualified. That is, due to marketplace distortions that well-funded aid groups may inadvertently create, some outstanding teachers, engineers, accountants, lawyers, doctors, nurses, and civil servants may happily give up their posts to become administrators, clerks, drivers, or manual laborers. If that happens, the overall costs their society bears when such people are no longer performing the jobs befitting their talents may substantially outweigh the relative gains their society gets due to their successfully fulfilling their new positions. One can understand aid groups wanting highly talented people to advance their goals. And one can hardly blame such people for bettering themselves and their families. Yet together, these perfectly understandable goals may contribute to an internal brain and character drain that the world's poorest countries can least afford. Thus, an aid group's gains, which are often readily identified, may be offset by indirect losses that are easily overlooked and difficult to quantify. This can result in a distorted picture of the overall good that aid groups achieve. Alas, given the countless aid groups operating in the world's poorest regions, the cumulative impact of the effects I've been describing may be substantial. Part 3, responsiveness and the importance of good governance. Let me turn next to a worry raised by Angus Deaton, the 2015 Nobel laureate in economics. Deaton is deeply concerned about the world's needy. But after searching for correlations between how much international aid a poor country receives and its level of social and economic development, Deaton has arrived at a striking conclusion. People like Peter Singer, and to a much less extent, me, for most of my life, are doing more harm than good. Specifically, Deaton believes that if we genuinely want to aid the world's needy, we must find some route to do so other than by contributing to aid groups that work directly in the world's poorest regions. Deaton recognizes that his view is deeply counterintuitive. It's hard to believe that if external funding pours into a region explicitly earmarked to help the needy, that the overall result should prove fruitless at best or harmful at worst. Still, several factors might support Deaton's counterintuitive conclusion. Consider first the so-called paradox of aid, which appears on the handout, which holds the following. In countries where the need is greatest, aid won't help. While in countries where aid would help most, it isn't needed. If there is a kernel of truth to this paradox, I say if, as many development economists in fact believe, it reflects the crucial role that governments play in their country's social and economic progress. The basic thought is that good governments find a way to take care of their people's basic needs, while poor governments are either unable or unwilling to do so. Even worse, poor governments tend to obstruct aid efforts so that any gains will be short-term at best. On this view, substantial and long-lasting social and economic gains require a well-functioning government, which can formulate and effectively implement plans to develop infrastructure, energy, food production, schools, the health system, and so on. Now, for Deaton, the key component of a well-functioning government is that it be responsive to its citizens. Yet, according to Deaton, international aid efforts in the world's poorest regions tend to undermine the government's responsiveness to their citizens. But to repeat, on Deaton's view, is precisely such responsiveness that is necessary for any poor country's long-term social and economic development. The mechanisms by which international aid may undermine government responsiveness are many. They include the following. First, as many have noted, there are many ways in which corrupt governments can divert aid resources to strengthen their positions and advance their agendas. They may impose licensing fees that fill their coffers on the international aid groups. They may tax or demand kickbacks from aid beneficiaries. They may extort bribes in return for government cooperation. They may insist that aid groups employ their supporters, require aid groups to supply them with food, medicine, or other supplies, and so on. All this can enable such governments to be indifferent and unresponsive to their government's needs, their citizens' needs, interests, and will, and to prioritize their own interests and that of their supporters. Second, in many of the world's poorest regions, many outside aid groups operate. Different agencies address hunger, poverty, rape, victims of sectarian violence, diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis, diarrhea, or AIDS, prenatal, postnatal, and maternal health care, healthcare more generally, education, female empowerment, infrastructure, and so on. Of course, some agencies address multiple concerns. This all sounds desirable. However, the more aid groups there are to help the needy, the easier it is for local governments to abdicate their responsibilities to provide for their citizens' basic needs and to leave that task to the outside aid groups. Local governments can then shift the blame for any unmet needs to the aid groups who have failed to fully deliver on their promises to help the needy. In this way, too, the well-intentioned interventions by aid groups can undermine a local government's responsiveness to its citizens' needs. But again, if Deaton is correct, such responsiveness is a key characteristic of good governance, without which there could be no hope of a lasting solution to the social and economic woes of the world's poorest nations. The preceding points are related to a third. Generally, effective governments depend on taxing their citizens in order to generate revenue to provide for their citizens' needs, to pay for basic government functions, and to advance the government's political agendas. However, the relation between a government and its taxpayers is special. Taxpayers want a say in how their money is spent. They want their government to provide for their basic needs, to protect and promote their interests, and to reflect their will. In other words, there will always be pressure for a government that taxes its citizens to be responsive to them. If it is not, it risks the citizens bucking the government, avoiding their taxes, and if the situation is dire, replacing the government with a more responsive one. However, in countries where substantial aid flows flow into the government's coffers, those governments can pursue their agendas without taxing their citizens to the same degree that they would otherwise have to. Correspondingly, citizens may feel less entitled to demand more from their government, as they can't insist on having more of a say in how their money is spent, if it isn't actually their money that is being spent. Moreover, in a nation where the government is receiving comparatively little tax money from its citizens, and where citizens' most pressing needs are being addressed by outside aid groups, the government can always claim, truthfully or not, that it lacks the resources to do more to help its citizens, and that it has established relations with aid groups to provide for its citizens' needs. So again, if the citizens' basic needs are unmet, the government can claim that the fault lies with the outside aid groups and not with its own inadequacies. In this way, too, aid efforts can undermine a government's responsiveness. Finally, consider the old adage, he who pays the piper calls the tune. This adage suggests that in poor countries, where much of government's operating revenue is sometimes derived from external groups rather than internal taxes, the governments of those countries will have strong reason to be responsive to the outside groups and much less reason to be responsive to their own citizens. There are two problems with this. First, there will often be a gap between what the outsiders would like to accomplish and how they want to accomplish it, and what the needy themselves would like done and how they would like it done. This raises troubling questions about paternalism, autonomy, and respect for local people and their values that I discuss in my book but cannot pursue here. Second, even if the aid groups are accomplishing much good so that there are good reasons for the government to support their efforts, it remains true that being responsive to the benevolent aims of outside aid groups is not the same as being directly responsive to one's citizens. But it's the latter that is the mark of good governance, not the former. In sum, Deaton believes that good governance is necessary for substantial and lasting social and economic progress in the world's poorest countries, and that good governance requires a government being responsive to its citizens. Unfortunately, however, international aid efforts in many of the world's poorest nations can undermine the responsiveness of their governments to their citizens. Deaton sums up his position as follows, I quote, "Aid and aid-funded projects have undoubtedly done much good. The roads, dams, and clinics exist and would not have existed otherwise. But the negative forces are always present. Even in good environments, aid compromises institutions, it contaminates local politics, and it undermines democracy. If poverty and underdevelopment are primarily consequences of poor institutions, then by weakening those institutions or stunting their development, large aid flows do exactly the opposite of what they are intended to do. It is hardly surprising then that, in spite of the direct effects of aid that are often positive, the record of aid shows no evidence of any overall beneficial effect," end quote. There are many responses to Deaton's view. One of the most natural raises some especially important and troubling issues. Let me turn to that next. I have to say, I am by temperament a pacer. I would normally be going back and forth. You guys would all be getting dizzy. I'd be waving my arms, there'd be stuff all over the boards. Here I am in my office sitting in a chair. Part 4, the problem of individual versus collective rationality and morality. Many are unconvinced by Deaton's worries. They see his critique as supporting effective altruism. Given that many people are in great need and that many others can help them at little cost to themselves, it is crucial to identify and support the most effective aid groups. Obviously, we shouldn't be supporting aid groups doing more harm than good, but equally obviously, it seems, there must be some aid groups doing more good than harm, and we should be supporting those groups. Unfortunately, this response ignores an important and troubling fact about practical reasoning. Namely, that conflicts can arise between individual and collective rationality and morality. The philosopher Derek Parfit has referred to such conflicts as each-we dilemmas. Each-we dilemmas arise when, if each of a number of individuals does what is best individually by the lights of a given theory, they collectively do worse by the lights of that same theory. The most famous examples of each we dilemmas are prisoners' dilemmas, much discussed by game theorists, economists, philosophers, and others. It is often true that if each of a large group does what is best for herself in self-interested terms, they together will be much worse off than they would have been if they had instead done what was best for the group as a whole. So, for example, each farmer is better off in self-interested terms, bringing as many crops to market as possible, no matter what the other farmers do. But together, the farmers would be better off if they brought fewer crops to market, since too many will collapse the crop's price. Similarly, each fisherman would be better off in self-interested terms, harvesting as many fish as possible, no matter what the other fishermen or women decide to do. But together, the fishermen would be better off if they harvested fewer fish, since harvesting too many will collapse the stocks and undermine their livelihoods, and so on. Parfit showed that each we dilemmas can arise for deontological moralities and not just self-interest. Specifically, Parfit showed that on deontological theories, people can be in the troubling position where if each of them does individually what she ought morally to do, they together will be doing something which collectively they ought not to do. Now, Parfit thought that these kinds of each we dilemmas could never arise for consequentialist theories. Contra Parfit, I have shown that similar results can also arise for consequentialist theories. In particular, I argue that if one accepts certain anti-additive aggregationist principles for comparing certain outcomes, as most people do, then even on consequentialist theories, people can be in the troubling position where if each of them does individually what she ought morally to do, then they together will be bringing about an outcome which collectively they morally ought not to bring about. Here is one such principle that's widely accepted. It's on your handout if you have that handy. The dispersed additional burdens view. In general, if additional burdens are dispersed among different people, it's better for a given total burden to be dispersed among a vast number of people so that the additional burden any single person has to bear within her life is relatively small, has no significant impact on the quality of her life, than for the total burden to fall on just a few people so that their additional burden is substantial. Here's an example. Suppose an aid group could provide farming equipment to a village, which would relieve hunger in that village for 1,000 people for 50 years. Or they could provide grain to 28 million people, relieving their hunger for a single day. In accordance with the dispersed additional burdens view, many people hold that the outcome in which 1,000 people had their hunger relieved for 50 years would be better than the outcome in which 28 million people had their hunger relieved for a single day, even though in the former case, there would only be 18.2 million days of hunger relief. This is because relieving someone's hunger for 50 years has a significant impact on the overall quality of her life, while relieving someone's hunger for only 1 day has relatively little overall impact on the overall quality of someone's life. For most people, the dispersed additional burdens view seems deeply compelling. However, it can give rise to consequentialist each we dilemmas. To see this, consider the following example, which again is on the handout. The reservoir, the drowning child, and the toxic watch battery. Uhuru was walking by a reservoir, here I channel my inner Peter Singer, where a child is drowning. If she pauses to remove her watch before diving in, the child will suffer severe brain damage. It's a complicated clasp. Take her a while to get it off. If she doesn't remove her watch, its battery will leach toxic chemicals into the reservoir, increasing its pollution by a very tiny amount. The reservoir is the main water source for 1 million people. What should Uhuru do? Uhuru might plausibly reason as follows. If she removes her watch first, this will significantly impact the child. If she doesn't, this will have a very small negative impact on each of the many people who depend on the reservoir's water. Since there are so many people using the water, the total amount of negative effects will be larger, we assume, if she doesn't remove her watch than if she does. Still, the distribution of those effects is very different. If she removes her watch, all of the negative effects will be borne by one single child. If she leaves her watch on, the negative effects will be dispersed across a vast number of people so that each of their lives would be barely impacted. They wouldn't even notice it. Given this, Uhuru might conclude, in accordance with the dispersed additional burdens view, that if she wants to produce the best possible outcome, she should dive in immediately and spare the child severe brain damage. Suppose that Uhuru is right about this. She would then be acting rightly in consequentialist terms. It's the better outcome. Notice, however, that Uhuru might not be the only person facing such a decision. Suppose that 30,000 others were in a similar predicament. No matter what anyone else did, each might act as Uhuru did, and for the same reasons. In doing so, each would produce the best of her available outcomes, and so be acting rightly as individuals in consequentialist terms. Still, the cumulative impact of 30,000 toxic batteries might be very bad indeed. In particular, while the individual negative impact on each person from the increased pollution level of a single watch battery might be very small, the collective negative impact of 30,000 batteries might be significant. Thus, it might well be that together, the significant negative impact on 1 million people would be worse than the negative impact of brain damage on 30,000 children. If so, Uhuru and her peers would face a consequentialist each-we dilemma. If, in accordance with the anti-additive aggregationist reasoning of the dispersed additional burdens view, each individual does what is best in consequentialist terms, they together end up producing an outcome which is worse in consequentialist terms. We can now see why Deaton might grant that some aid agencies do more good than harm, and yet resist the effective altruist view that we should identify and support those groups. For Deaton, the issue isn't whether each individual aid group is bringing about a desirable outcome. His concern is with the collective impact of such groups. If the preceding is correct, it could be that each of us only supports aid groups that individually are bringing about a desirable outcome, and yet that collectively the groups are bringing about an undesirable outcome. These considerations help illuminate Deaton's position as well as most people's reactions to it. Deaton urges us not to support aid groups operating in some of the world's poorest countries on the grounds that doing so weakens government responsiveness. But most people find this view unbelievable. As individuals, each thinks of the great good that her particular contribution might do. By contrast, She thinks that the extent to which her individual contribution will weaken a government's responsiveness to its citizens will be ludicrously small. Thus, intuitively, it seems that the negative impact that her contribution will have on each of the country's many citizens will be so small as to not even be noticeable. Therefore, in accordance with the dispersed additional burdens view, her individual contribution will seem desirable, contrary to what Deaton seems to be suggesting. This reasoning is problematic, but even if it were not, it misses Deaton's point. Deaton isn't taking the ground level perspective of what each individual donation or aid group is or is not accomplishing. Deaton is taking the 30,000 foot view of things. He's looking at the net impact of vast numbers of individual acts on behalf of the needy. And what he sees or thinks he sees from that perspective is that the collective negative impact of those vast numbers of individual acts is quite substantial. Thus, while I individually may have virtually no impact on a government's responsiveness to its citizens, we together can have a substantial impact on its responsiveness. And of course, Deaton believes that ultimately a government's responsiveness to its citizens is the crucial component for substantial and lasting social and economic progress. This is why Deaton urges us not to support aid groups operating directly in some of the world's poorest countries. His contention needn't be that each of us individually is bringing about an undesirable outcome. It is rather that we collectively are bringing about an undesirable outcome. As we have seen, if principles like the dispersed additional burdens view are correct, the latter can be true, even if the former is not. Conflicts between individual and collective rationality and morality are profoundly troubling. Arguably, they lie at the root of many of our most pressing social and political problems, and they can be particularly intractable. Climate change comes to mind. Unfortunately, the domain of obligations to the needy is no exception to this. Effective altruists may be right that many effective aid groups are promoting desirable outcomes. Given this, perhaps each of us individually ought morally to support such groups. Yet despite this, it's possible that collectively we ought not to support such groups. Since if we do, we together may be promoting undesirable outcomes. If that is our real world predicament, then it may be very clear what each individual should do, and also very clear what we together should do. But what would remain painfully unclear is how one could defensively reconcile the two opposing perspectives. Part 5, Goma. In April 1994, extremist Hutus in Rwanda began a campaign of genocide. Within 3 weeks, some 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered. By the time journalists were reporting the genocide, they were also filming a mass exodus of 2 million Rwandan refugees. The largest group ended up in refugee camps near Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As the only refugee area with a landing strip, Goma was the only area where the refugees' plight could be captured live on the nightly news. When cholera broke out, journalists referred to it as a second genocide, and each night the world watched graphic scenes of bodies being bulldozed into mass graves. The result was a record-setting campaign to aid Goma's Rwandan genocide victims. More than $1.5 billion was raised for immediate relief, and more than 250 international aid agencies, including every major one, flew into Goma as part of the world's best funded humanitarian operation to date. For the aid agencies, it was imperative that they be seen as responsive to the world's largest genocide since the 1970s Cambodian genocide. The refugee camps offered an extraordinary opportunity to establish their brand and to secure funding from governments, foundations, and individual donors that would carry them for years to come. Daily press conferences were hosted by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, where each major NGO gave an account of what was happening. According to one journalist there at the time, I quote, "Each one would give a higher death toll than the last, because each knew that the one with the highest death toll would get on the nightly news, which meant that you got money." And that is how the NGOs manipulated the media in Goma, end quote. By the end of 1995, Goma's refugee camps had 2,324 bars, 450 restaurants, 590 shops, more than 60 hair salons, 50 pharmacies, 30 tailors, 4 photo studios, 3 cinemas, and 2 hotels. So far, the picture is one of aid organizations using the Rwandan genocide to burnish their credentials, fill their coffers, and attract donors by providing aid to refugees, perhaps long past when it was actually needed. The cinemas didn't need to be built. But alas, the full picture is far darker. What the aid organizations were either willfully ignorant of or purposely declined to reveal to their donors was that the Goma refugees were not, in fact, Tutsi, the victims of the Rwandan genocide, but Hutu, many of whom perpetrated that genocide. In fact, the exodus from Rwanda had been a tactical withdrawal, which included the entire Rwandan Hutu army and tens of thousands of extremists who had helped carry out the Rwandan killings. Indeed, the entire extremist Hutu government had relocated to Goma, taking up residence in the tourist hotels outside the city. The chilling details of all this were described by veteran war correspondent Linda Pullman in her powerful book, The Crisis Caravan. They are, I believe, so important as to merit quoting or closely paraphrasing at some length. I hereby do so. This is all quote or slight paraphrase. Some of the dead in Goma had not succumbed to cholera, but had been murdered by Hutu militias. In the first month alone, 4,000 were beaten or stabbed to death. On all food rations distributed by aid organizations, the extremist Hutu government, from its tourist hotels, levied a war tax to pay its army, which enabled it to continue its Tutsi extermination campaign back in Rwanda. The inhabitants of the camp, now well-rested, well-nourished, and inoculated, were a source of new recruits who were inflamed by radio stations broadcasting that crushing a Tutsi cockroach isn't murder, it's a hygiene measure. And here one can't help but think of Mala and Solomon Kamm in Nazi Germany. Almost every night, the militias crept back into Rwanda to go to Tutsi hunting. They also struck mercilessly at Tutsis born in Goma. Hundreds of local Tutsis went missing or were found dead with bullets through their hearts or with their throats slit. The Hutu violence went unpunished. As the special representative of the UN Secretary General put it, everyone knows what has to be done, but who will bell the cat? That's a quote. Traitors to the Hutu cause had their arms or legs hacked off by Hutu militias, and dead rape babies were regularly pulled out of camp latrines. Some INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, estimated that on average, militias stole 60% of all aid supplies, partly for their own use and partly to sell back to civilians in the camps. The World Food Program once found a boat at the entrance to its food camp, calmly loading rice sacks for the hotels housing the Hutu government. Fearful of bad publicity, the INGOs kept quiet about the thefts. Instead, they inflated the number of people living in the camps in reports to their donors so their losses would be made up. Thousands of extremists insisted that they be given jobs as drivers, technicians, administrative staff, cooks, cleaners, and managers in the many distribution centers run by the INGOs, and in their water supply and building projects, social programs for orphans and disabled people, and family reunion and educational services. Hutu camp leaders creamed off a percentage of every salary. At one point, MSF Belgium, Doctors Without Borders, was employing 550 Hutu personnel in one camp at an average monthly salary of $100. According to some estimates, the Hutu leaders were collecting taxes of $11,000 a month from the staff of that one organization alone. I remind you, there were at least 250 operating. Charities providing medical treatment hired Hutu nurses for night duty since it was too dangerous after dark for Western staff. Fiona Terry, regional manager, project manager of MSF France at the time, later admitted that doctors suspected the nurses of murdering patients insufficiently loyal to the Hutu cause. In the mornings, international staff would find relatives of Hutu leaders in the beds that had become free. Finally, to end the material taken more or less directly from Pullman, at Goma, Hutu leaders routinely paid cash for deliveries of weapons from the outside, although sometimes they bartered for new weapons using stolen aid supplies. Okay, end of her story. Eventually, some 200,000 militia and their families fled deeper into the bush. Those militia and their families protected, cared for, nourished, and rearmed, thanks in part to the massive international aid effort in Goma, continued to play a significant role in the decades-long bloodletting that engulfed Central Africa, a bloodletting which by 2010 had already claimed an estimated 5 million lives. Fiona Terry, I mentioned before, the former regional project manager for MSF France, once described Goma as a, quote, total ethical disaster, end quote. I have gone into detail about that disaster because Goma is a stark reminder that the worries raised here are not mere abstract philosophical possibilities. They arise in real world contexts, sometimes in unimaginably horrifying ways. In Goma, many aid recipients were largely responsible for their situation. Beyond that, many were mutilators and murderers who had committed atrocities on a grand scale. Oddly, as noted already, aid agencies either failed to notice or conveniently declined to explain to their donors that the aid recipients were not the victims of the Rwandan genocide, but rather, in many cases, the perpetrators of that genocide. Relatedly, in Goma, many aid agencies seem more concerned about raising money by being seen as delivering aid during a global emergency than with whether the aid was actually needed or who was receiving it. Aid organizations loudly trumpeted their aid distributions, but weren't looking for, much less reporting, the many ways in which their aid was being diverted or misused. Nor did they report the terrible consequences of all that. Indeed, even where they knew that aid was being stolen, agencies often covered up that fact, in some cases even falsifying reports so as to keep the aid funds flowing. And of course, no one was looking at the long-term regional consequences of healing, protecting, nourishing, and enabling the rearming of a genocidal Hutu government and extremist militia. Goma concretely illustrates the many ways that corrupt powers can profit from international aid efforts by directly receiving aid provisions, stealing aid, forcing aid agencies to employ their members, and taxing the employees of aid agencies. Together, the massive aid effort in Goma increased the wealth, status, and power of the Hutu government and the extremist Hutu militias. This didn't merely result in their feathering their own nests. Rather, it enabled them to regroup, consolidate their power, recruit new members, and continue their campaign of murder, rape, and mutilation against the Tutsi and anyone else who was insufficiently loyal to the Hutu cause. Aid skeptics have long warned of the misuse, ineffectiveness, or counterproductiveness of foreign aid. They have come from the ranks of journalists, aid workers, government officials, and academics. Unfortunately, too often their warnings have been dismissed as the rantings of disgruntled former employees, disillusioned idealists, attention-seeking alarmists, right-wing libertarians, or outliers. I'm guilty of having made such claims myself many times over the years. Further, the tendency has been to assume that cases like Goma can be safely ignored as one-off instances reflecting the actions of a few bad apples, tragic exceptions to the overwhelming good that aid agencies do overall. I have always held such a view myself for most of my life, and I still want it to be true, but I am now leery of such claims. We've heard them too often. Rumors of pedophilia within the Catholic Church were first dismissed, then downplayed, and then attributed to the actions of just a few bad apples. Surely, we all thought, there couldn't be a major, pervasive problem throughout the church. Similar responses arose, at least initially, regarding sexual predation within the Boy Scouts, and later the gymnastics community. Likewise, allegations against Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and David Epstein were initially dismissed, then downplayed, and then regarded finally as the inappropriate actions of a few bad apples. Similarly, brutality against African Americans, from Rodney King to Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and countless others, prompts the same refrain. Tragic incidents, to be sure, but one-offs perpetrated by a few bad apples. It is, of course, a mistake to overgeneralize based on the actions of a few. However, it's also a mistake to too quickly dismiss horrifying events as one-off misdeeds perpetrated by a few bad apples. Agents and their actions don't exist in a vacuum. Often widespread systematic attitudes and behaviors give rise to the few bad apples and their misdeeds. Moreover, often the most egregious attitudes and events are only the tip of the iceberg in terms of attitude and events of that kind that persist throughout society, whether it's racism or sexism or any of these other areas. And what lies unobserved beneath the surface of society can often be just as destructive or more as that which lies out in the open sea for all to observe. Goma was not the canary in the coal mine. Goma was the disaster that ensued when the canary's death was ignored. Moreover, unfortunately, there have been many dead canaries and many aid disasters. Horror stories abound concerning aid in virtually every region dominated by armed conflict or controlled by thugs, warlords, tyrants, or corrupt officials. Sadly, this includes many regions where the need is greatest and where aid efforts have been extensive, such as Afghanistan, Algeria, Angola, Biafra, Bosnia, Congo, Croatia, East Timor, Ethiopia, Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, Liberia, Libya, Monrovia, Pakistan, Serbia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Uganda, and of course, as we've already seen, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In sum, I believe that Goma was not a one-off. I think it is only the tip of the iceberg, a particularly hellacious example, but far from the only one of the many ways that aid efforts can go awry. If we really care about aiding the needy and not merely feeling good that we have tried to do so, then we cannot ignore cases like Goma and the wider questions that they raise. Part 6, concluding remarks. In this talk, I've had to ignore most of the topics addressed in my forthcoming book, Being Good in a World of Need, including what, if anything, follows from the worries raised here. Moreover, even the topics I have addressed have only been broached in the most superficial manner. Still, having run out of time, let me end with the following deeply unsatisfying observation. I remain convinced, as I have been throughout my life, that the well-off, you and me, are open to serious moral criticism if they ignore the plight of the world's needy. Unfortunately, what one should do in light of that truth is much more complex and murky than most people have realized. That's it. Thank you very much.
Great. I think get to be the symbolic. I am one clapping for many, many. So thank you so much. Very powerful, challenging argument. Francis has a question.
Great.
I'm going to invite Francis to ask the first question. Let me remind everybody of the Q&A function, and then Arthur, Linda, Zhao, if one of you has a question as well, we'll turn to you before going to the Q&A function, okay? But Francis.
Can I be heard?
We can hear you.
Okay. So Larry, thanks for that super talk. You said superficial, but you began by saying super, and you were right the first time, okay? What I want to ask is a two-part question, and in a way, it's reveals my uncertainty about these issues as well. What I want to know is, does the critique of foreign NGOs coming into the local economy or the local world, right, apply as well to, or would the critique apply as well to internal NGOs? So insofar as they reduce the need for the government to be responsive, the Red Cross will go in and help and so forth and so on. Yet we wouldn't want to say that we want to get rid of a strong civil society where non-governmental agencies have important roles, because that's an important part of balancing the threat of an overpowering government. In virtue of the absence of these other organizations, the government may also become less responsive to the people, right? Because it becomes overpowering. So it seems to me that the critique of undermining government responsiveness with respect to NGOs is maybe too broad, because you could see how it could be applied to local NGOs, and it would be a mistake in that area to imply that it gives the right conclusion. The second part of my question is a possible solution. It's said that responsiveness to taxpayers is lost when money comes from outside to the government. That was one of your points. People who do not contribute to the government don't feel they have a right then to say how the government should be organized. Well, it's probably not workable, but it seems like an obvious response is, one possible response is NGOs give money directly to the people with the requirement that they pay part of that money as taxes to the government. So the money is funneled to the people who then become taxpayers with that money. They don't just spend it on themselves, okay? Now, that's just thinking about it as taking account of the factors you present. The money is going to the government and the NGOs. The taxpayers don't have control. NGOs funnel the money to the people with the condition that they be using the money in part, at least, for taxes to support their government, and therefore they have a say in how the government should work. All right. Now, this may sound foolish, but it just, when you think about so-called logical implications of what has been the complaints, it seems like, on the one hand, with respect to local NGOs, the complaint is too broad. On the other hand, with respect to where the NGO should funnel the money, there may be something of a, at least from the point of view of logic, a solution. What would you say?
Good. Thanks, Francis, for both of those comments. I'm going to say something which is not very helpful here, but I think these are matters of degree, matters of scale. The objections apply with greater or less force in different countries, in different situations, and with different local versus external NGOs. Many of my concerns were directed at external NGOs, not internal NGOs. And one of the reasons for that, well, multiple reasons for that, but just quickly remind you, is if you have an internal NGO, it's sponsored by internal monies, that's not likely to be able, I say, like, these are always empirical questions. It's what's happening or not happening, but they're not going to have the same resources typically on average as external NGOs. So some of the issues of brain and character drain that I was referring to in the first place are more of a problem for an external NGO that can come in and just outbid the marketplace than most local NGOs that are dealing with, local scales of finances and resources and so on. And also in terms of responsiveness, I think if a local NGO forms and puts forward, things that it cares about greatly, and for one reason or another, the government ends up being responsive to those local NGOs, that's still being responsive to local people who are concerned about local problems and local issues. When we come in from the outside and we say, here's what you need to do, this is what we care about, and we're going to flood you with money, you become responsive to the outside donors. And that's not, I believe, the same as being responsive even to a subgroup of local NGOs. Now, the other question you raised is, does this just offer another kind of NGO that we should be supporting? Well, I do discuss one of these kinds of NGOs in my book, and there's quite a lot of discussion about the pros and cons of this kind of NGO, but there's a kind of NGO like Give Directly that does believe we should just give money directly to local people. And if we give money directly to local people to spend however they want, the argument has been made that this will be better in many respects. And this ties in, it lets them choose what's important to them. We're not dictating to them. So some of the issues of autonomy are less important for that kind of NGO than other NGOs that want to go in and tell you how you should or shouldn't treat the women in your society or whatever. So that's a kind of NGO that's people have discussed, trumpeted. Many people think it's a terrifically strong one. And those people with that money that they get could be taxed on it and pay it to the government. That's all true. But many of the kinds of problems I raised still arise even with Give Directly. There are a number of problems that's been debated in literature, whether that is or isn't as effective as people think. And there are ways that corrupt governments can get their hands on the money that's earmarked for them directly beyond just taxes. And that's where the problem really comes in. And it should be very important. I mean, I had a very short amount of time to just touch on a lot of issues. That's why I said it was superficial. But some of these kinds of objections apply insofar as they do to particular countries, many of the countries that are poorest and that also have the poorest governments. Now, by poorest, I don't just mean economically, but in other respects as well. Some of these objections would, and they also apply when there's a distorting influence, when the amount of outside aid is disproportional to what the governments would otherwise have on their own. If you sent money to China or to India, it would have no effect on their government policies because the amount you would send relative to their general GDP would be insignificant. It has a big effect when you send it to some of the countries I'm talking about here. And so one of the lessons about this is if what you care about are individuals who are badly off, rather than countries that are badly off, you may be able to find individuals that are badly off that you could effectively help in countries that aren't governed or liable to unstable governments. And that would be a more effective way of spending your money.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francis.
Zhao, would you like to?
So I have two questions. Not that you have claimed that, but it doesn't seem like the dispersed additional burdens will intuitively captures many of the shortcomings of the cases you mentioned. For example, hiring the most qualified locals who causing brain drain or the failed aid in Goma. It seems those cases have more to do with incomplete information about what everyone else is doing, how many others are doing the same, and the large scale long-term consequences of one actions. So if that's the case, then it's not necessarily that when people do individually what they have most reason to do, they together do something bad, but is that when they individually do something without taking into account the large scale and group consequences, then they end up doing something bad. So for example, in your example with Uhuru, she could, in this sort of large scale example, she could consider that other people would be doing that too, and that would be harmful. So therefore, that would be a harmful behavior, and she would remove her watch before jumping. A second question is, it seems like one case that we could make again against effective altruism would be that what they are doing is probably worse than nothing, or it has harmful effects, and therefore we should stop. And another argument would be, instead of doing what they're doing, they could be trying to affect changing those governments. So for example, they could pressure their own lawmakers to enact legislation that would put pressure on them through trade agreements and so on. In Brazil, we had this extremely corrupt politician, Maluf, where he couldn't leave the country because if he left, he would be arrested in other countries. So obviously that put pressure in Brazil to actually arrest him here where he did commit the crimes. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much for that question. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, I may have been a little bit unclear, so I'm sorry about that. But vis-a-vis your first point, there were a number of worries that were raised here, and most of the worries that were raised were not related to the dispersed additional burdens view. So the issue about, internal brain and character drain, that has nothing to do with the dispersed additional burdens view. The dispersed additional burdens view is a view that I believe that many people find plausible. I find it plausible. Francis does. We both publish on topics has to do with how we think about aggregating. And it's an issue that is directly relevant to only the one particular topic I was raising, which is the issue of the conflict between the individual and the collective. And the possibility that it can be the case that each of us does the right thing, but we together do the wrong thing. Now, you raise the possibility that if I know that other people are going to act in a certain way, that would give me reason to act differently than I otherwise would. That's the intuitively plausible way of thinking about it, but I'm just going to gently suggest that we could argue about it more lately. It's not right in this case. It's like the structure of a prisoner's dilemma. You might say, well, it's a dominance issue. In a standard prisoner's dilemma, each of us can do what's best for ourselves and we can help others more, total. And the question is, what is everyone else going to do? But the answer to the question, what I ought to do in terms of what's in my interest, is unrelated to what anybody else does. Because whatever anybody else does, either they all act in my interest or they act in their interest, whatever they do, I'm better off if I act in my interest than if I act in their interest. That's true for me. It's true for each of them. Together, we end up worse off. Now, the thing about a consequentialist dilemma, this is the one technical part of the talk. And so I didn't go into it in much detail because I only had 40 minutes, but it's the same kind of structure. The point is, even if I know that everyone else is going to jump in with their watches and they're going to do a little polluting, I still have reason to take my watch off because the difference that my one amount of pollution makes is very, very small. And I can save a life. So yes, I'll have a small effect on a lot of people, but they're going to be badly off anyway if lots of other people have jumped in. So what difference does it make if I make them a little bit worse off versus saving a life? So it really is the structure of this kind of case that it doesn't matter whether I know what everyone else is going to do. Whatever anyone else is going to do, I will do more good by the lights of this kind of principle if I don't take the watch off. But that's true for each of us. And that has terrible consequences collectively, but not individually. So I want to suggest that's the right way to think about this. I can send you more stuff on this to clarify it more. I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question. Could you just briefly remind me?
Sorry, that a stronger critique, it seems to be that instead that we should stop with the aid and do nothing, is that we should pressure the government to try to affect a structural change, for example, of laws that make corruption criminal, even in other countries.
Excellent, thanks for the reminder. That's a hugely important point, and I agree with that. This is a critique against so I'm never gonna say we shouldn't be trying to help people who are in need. But the question is, how should we go about that? The critiques raised here in this talk were about certain forms of aid, on the ground, face-to-face aid in some of the world's poorest countries where these problems can arise. But many of the deepest problems that arise in these countries are connected to things that are related to, for example, what economists and others call the resource curse. We have international laws that reward people in power. If you're in power, you can sell the resources of your country legally by international law to anybody else. This incentivizes coups, disruptions, all sorts of problems in poor countries around the world that are filled with resources. This is why it's called the resource curse, because you have these countries that are rich in natural resources, but are constantly undergoing civil war because whoever takes control can sell the resources and use those resources to benefit themselves and their followers. Well, there's a sense in which external aid that pours into country is a form of resource that can also be a resource curse. It can lead to similar problems. But that doesn't mean we have to allow this. One of the things we should be doing is to be working very hard to change the rules of international law and international commerce to not allow any thug that comes to power to sell off their country's resources with impunity. So I'm going to agree completely with that. There are things that can be done. There are things that should be done. There are things that we should do. They're not easily done, by the way. This is not an easy fix because it really takes a thorough reexamination of, as it were, international laws and international financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all of these organizations, the WTO, World Trade Organization, all of which effectively work on behalf of the richest countries of the world because of the very structure that they have. But I agree, that's one of the places we should be looking. And if we could make those kinds of changes, it would benefit people in the poorest countries enormously.
Thank you for that exchange. I'm going to go ahead and pull some of the questions from the Q&A. I may be able to get back, Linda, to you as well. We'll see for time. But I'm going to start with two that are both playing out the implications of your argument with slightly different areas of focus. But I'm going to go ahead and share them both because I think they're sort of interesting in relationship to each other too. So this from Thierry Ngoso. Would you say that the best possible help from Western wealthy people would be no help at all, at least in the form described by Singer and the former you, forcing the needy to find their way by themselves and forcing their governments to become responsive to them? And in the case of some African countries, the reason the government fails, meaning bad governance, is mostly because the infrastructure of the Western state does not suit, that is to say that the use of Western infrastructure in the African state does not suit the sociological reality of that state. So that's question one, is the best possible help no help at all? And then question two, what do you say to the worry that upon having convincingly argued for your position, this thesis might also have unintended consequences, whereby a critical mass of persons decide to give up on giving? What if the takeaway from your claim for others after being fully disseminated is that moral inertia with regard to giving ensues?
Great, thanks. Thanks for both of those questions. I'm going to take the last one first, then we're going to go back to the first one. I should have written them down. I may need you to briefly remind me, but just take a second on the first one. I can't tell you how often I laid awake, worried about whether I should ever publish these views. And it's related to the first one. I mean, what is the takeaway? Are we just going to say, oh, let's not do anything? I mean, I've been committed to trying to help the needy my entire life. In my book, I tell stories about when I was a little kid. And the idea that I, after all these years of commitment to this, working for it, starting programs at various universities and so on to aid the needy, and raising money in my numerous classes over many years of large amounts and sending it off to Doctors Without Borders and Oxfam and Africare and all these other things. And now I come along with these arguments that seem to suggest like, let's just wash our hands of this, and anything we do is not going to help, so blah, 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 blah. I mean, I've had cold chills about this for years. I mean, since I started working on this topic. On the other hand, although I worry greatly whether that there could be unintended consequences of this that are bad, I worry greatly that there'd be unintended consequences of not taking these issues seriously and publishing them and looking at them carefully, that those could be bad. I mean, for most of my life, independently of Singer, but also following Singer, I mean, I just thought it was so obvious. There are people in need. I'm incredibly well off. I could help them at little or no cost to myself. If there would be little or no cost to myself and I could save someone's life, it's got to be immoral not to do that. That was the thought. But of course, to be honest, Singer in his original article, we're only looking at two people. There's just the person I can save, and there's how much would it cost me, and then it's clear as a bell what we should do. But in all these cases I'm discussing Goma and elsewhere, there's not just two people. There's all the other people that will be involved by and affected by as a result of the consequence of both my action and the collective actions of many of us like this. So do I think the best thing is to do nothing at all? Well, I do think it might be better to do nothing at all in some of these countries. And I would really want to limit the scope of these claims than to do what we're often currently actually doing. It might be better to do nothing at all. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. But that doesn't mean I think we should do nothing at all, as my response to the earlier question suggests. I think we have to look hard for other avenues of helping even the worst off people, even in the worst off countries, other than the traditional one of boots on the ground methods that have been tried to a large extent without success for a long time. Now, I do want to say one other thing about this. In my work, I've been discussing today the possible bad consequences that are often overlooked with on-the-ground aid in some of the world's poorest countries. That is very much a kind of consequentialist-like perspective of the effect of altruists. How much good are you doing? How much bad are you doing? As if that should determine whether we help or not. But I am not a consequentialist. I'm a pluralist. I believe there are many things that are relevant to the conditions under which we aid and how we aid. And I think it can often be the case that we ought morally to do things, even if we know that they'd have a worse outcome from the standpoint of effective altruism. If there's someone drowning in a pond right there in front of me, I have an expensive watch on me, and it's going to be ruined if I save them. I think I have an obligation to save them, even if it's going to ruin my watch. Now, suppose someone says, oh, but Larry, if instead of saving you, you let them drown, you take your watch, you sell it, you give the proceeds to an effective charity, you could save two people instead of one. That's what you ought morally to do. I don't believe that. The effective altruist might believe that. Peter might believe that, but I don't believe that. I believe that I have to save the drowning child there, even if I could more effectively save two people by letting him drown. Okay. So whether or not we should help is not just a question in my mind of how would we do or not do the most good. It's also relevant to other issues related to virtue ethics, related to deontological considerations of the sort that Francis has championed better than anybody else alive, etc. And I only put that on the table for the following reason. I think there are going to be some cases where there's enormous humanitarian emergencies, even in the world's poorest countries where the poorest governments where we might have a moral obligation to go in and help the people who are dying now, even if we know that we might do more harm than good by doing so. Because to me, it's not always just a matter about whether we're doing the most good we can. It's a complex concatenation of moral reasons that we have to act, which include reasons besides how do we do the most good. So sometimes just the humanitarian crisis itself, in my judgment, will make a claim on us that may outweigh some of these considerations.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna turn to Linda and let her ask the final question, and give you a chance, Larry, for a final word. Okay,
Great.
Linda.
Great, thanks so much for the brilliant talk. I think my question follows pretty directly from what you just said. I was wondering how we should think about the relationship between individual duties to aid and implications that might have for governance and responsiveness and so on. And I was wondering whether one of the reasons why we might be troubled if the implication were that we just shouldn't do anything would be something like the following. So in the standard pond case, if saving the child would also involve saving a wrongdoer who might then go and harm 5 other children, if that were the reason not to save the child, then should we worry that maybe something like an omission that would use the child as a means or something like that? Is that how we should think about this? Is that how you'd approach this? And what should we do in that regard?
Okay, that's a great question, and thank you for it. We have supposedly 3 minutes left. I don't know if we cut off exactly at the way I got into we cut off exactly. Okay, so now all I'm going to say is I think morality is extraordinarily complex. I'm a pluralist. I think we have to give weight to all of these questions that virtue ethicists think about, that Francis thinks about, the ontologists think about, acts versus omissions. I think, the way I originally got into this is I had a dinner party at my house, and we had a lot of people sitting here talking, including Angus Deaton and Derek Parford and so on. And we started talking about these issues. I couldn't sleep that night. I started thinking about Peter Singer's examples, and I came up with like 30 different versions of the pond example. And in some of them, like, you can't cross the pond to save the child until you shoot someone. Well, I can't do that. But what if I can't cross the pond until I hand a gun to someone and I know he's going to shoot someone? Can I do that? So all these questions about an act versus an omission versus am I complicit? In what cases, when I know that something terrible is going to happen, can I wash my hands of it and say, well, I didn't do that. They're the ones who did it. I just saved someone. But I mean, these are deep, difficult moral questions. And I think one has to give full weight to, this is not a helpful answer, but I think it's a true answer. I think you just have to give weight to all of the complexity that really arises in these questions. And so there isn't a single answer to any one of these cases. It really does depend on the details. And we learned that from Francis as well as from any person in the world. You change the detail a teeny tiny bit, and one thing comes as relevant that wasn't there before. So we have to look at all of these things, but I absolutely am concerned about, are we using someone as a means to an end? Are we complicit in an action? Are we contributing knowingly or not? And under what conditions does that make me culpable? I think all of those factors are relevant.
Larry, thank you so much. We are all here possessed of the conviction that the truth is always helpful, even when it's complex and there's not a single answer. So thank you so much for exemplifying that commitment to truth and the commitment to very serious moral reasoning that this lecture is meant to showcase. You have really set us off in this series in the best possible way and set a standard for others to come. So thank you very much for a tremendous lecture this evening.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle, and everybody for inviting me, and everyone who's listening in. I can't see you, but thanks for taking the time.
Yes, thank you all for joining us, and good night, as they say. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.
My pleasure.